Again, welcome to our third and final session of our eWord webinar series, where we do a little further exploration of the evangelism for non-evangelists equation that Mark Teasdale and I have taught now, I think 6 or 7 times. And personally for me, it's been a lot of fun. As much as I really love working with Mark and teaching with him, it's been a lot of fun to bring in some of our other evangelism professors to dialogue and to learn from them, and for them to share some of their expertise and unique ways of approaching evangelism. So tonight, I'm really excited to have Reverend Dr. F. Douglas Powe Jr., Doug, with us, who wears a lot of hats. As you can see there on the screen, he's currently the director of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership, the James C. Logan Professor of Evangelism, which is an E. Stanley Jones Professorship, and Professor of Urban Ministry, all at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Doug. We're so glad to have you
Glad to be
tonight.
with you.
Thank you. And again, I'm Heather Lear, and since July have had the privilege of serving as the Research and Teaching Fellow at the Foundation for Evangelism. And it's been a lot of fun exploring ways that we can continue to find ways to resource and help people understand what evangelism looks like in the 21st century in the Wesleyan way. And today's webinar and this webinar series has been made possible and provided at no cost to you by a grant from the Foundation for Evangelism, where for over 70 years, our mission has been to be a catalyst to equip disciples to share the good news of Jesus Christ. And we do that by nurturing generative leaders, equipping disciples, transforming lives and communities, and trying to create synergy and partnership between laity and clergy. And here, just as a reminder, a refresher, is our formula for navigating evangelism that we've been working through in this series. Dr. Jack Jackson started us off addressing starting point and kind of how we can go about sharing our faith and being able to articulate what we believe in a meaningful and authentic way. Last week, Dr. Lacey Warner helped us to look at what does holistic Wesleyan discipleship look like? What is the grounding of our faith and of our practices? And so we're really excited tonight to bring Dr. Powe in as he works a lot with church leaders and different ministry contexts to help us think about contextual awareness and how in our ministry and the way we approach evangelism, we can be contextually nimble. So with that, Doug, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to start walking us through some of your latest work, which I'm really excited to hear about.
Thank you. Let me first say thank you to Jack and Lacey, who have shared with you previously, and also a tremendous thank you to the Foundation, and particularly Jane, for hosting this series. I'm going to just talk for a few minutes so we can have plenty of time for conversation. But I want to begin with the Romans 12:2a text that you see in front of you. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I think this text is important to sort of set the context, not to use a play on words, because too often in our congregations, we sort of are conforming to patterns that we structure and build, and we're not allowing the Holy Spirit to work to actually transform us so that we're able to do new things. And when we do that, what happens is that we find there's a disconnect between what we're doing often inside of our congregations that doesn't help us to connect with those who are outside of the walls of the congregation. And I'm hoping tonight what we can talk about is how do we bridge that disconnect so we can do a better job of connecting with those outside. As we get ready to go to the next slide, I want to talk before I actually talk about the 4I model. let me just give a little bit of background on some of the challenges that I think we face inside of our church walls, of why we sort of create, I think, contexts that aren't always helpful. And one way of thinking about this is what I call an insider mentality. We start seeing things in a certain way within our congregation, and we get blinded to the way that others actually see us. So often when you go to a church, and I visited many churches, and almost every church I've ever visited will say they are the friendliest church that you will ever find. And to a certain extent, they're telling the truth. They are friendly, but usually they're friendly towards each other, and they're not necessarily friendly to those who they see as outsiders. But the point is that because of their interactions with each other, they're blinded to the way that they are sort of treating visitors or those who are not a part of the inner circle. The other piece for sort of inside is the way that we start taking practices and make them a tradition in our congregations. Many of you have heard the story of the grandmother who used to take and cut the roast on both sides before she put it in the pan in the oven. And then mom did the same thing. And then, of course, seeing mom do it, the children picked up doing the same thing. And finally, someone asked a question, why do you cut off both sides of the roast? And, you know, they found out she did it because the pan wasn't big enough to hold the roast. But no one ever actually took the time to ask the why question and just assume that was the way you do it. We often do that in our congregations, that we'll see a practice and we'll make it a tradition and keep doing it, even though that practice may not be healthy. And we need to make sure that we're asking those why questions and not just simply doing things because we've always done them that way. And the last thing I want to say is that we have to make sure that we're always seeking in what we do to connect with those outside. And to give a concrete example of this, thinking of an Easter egg hunt. Oftentimes when we have a lot of children, or there was a time when we had a lot of children in the church, and we would have an Easter egg hunt for the children in the church. But as years have gone by, we've seen that our number of children have dwindled, but we continue to have an Easter egg hunt because we've always done it that way. And there may be a lot of children in the community, but we never think about moving the Easter egg hunt outside to the community. We keep it inside and continue to keep that same sort of tradition moving instead of trying to connect with those outside of the church. So we create this sort of insider mentality within our congregations that creates an unhealthy context, in many cases, inside of the church. Now, not everything we do inside of the church is unhealthy, but in many of our congregations, there's enough of these practices that lead us to have a disconnect with those outside of the congregation. And here's where I want to pick up with the slide you see in front of you for what I term the 4I model of ministry entrepreneurship. And what we're really after here is thinking about a way congregations can really connect with those that are in their community, and sort of have a process that can help them think about how you do this and can do this well. So I'm going to walk you sort of through the 4 key points of this model. And the key here is keeping our eye on the centerpiece, which is the reign of God, so that we're doing this because I'm sure, and the others have talked about discipleship, that we're really making disciples and really participating in the reign of God. So it's not about sort of just simply getting members, but it's really about becoming disciples for Christ. And as we look at the next slide, let's begin with inquire. So what is critically important is oftentimes in congregations, what we do is we have a tendency to create things for the community that we think are good, but we never actually go and do any sort of inquiry in the community itself. We often will set up a committee, and the committee will come with an idea, and we'll try that idea out. So for example, we may say, hey, what we really need to do is start a nursery school, because what we need in this community is a nursery school. But we haven't actually gone out in the community and done any investigation to figure out that the community already has 3 nursery schools, and what was really needed was a senior sort of day center where seniors could come for a few hours and have community with one another. So inquiry is critically important, because what it does is we're talking to individuals in the community and we're finding out what are the assets that already exist in the community, and can we partner with those assets so we don't have to create it from scratch. In many cases, in many of our congregations, we have limited resources, so when we do inquiry, it actually helps us to use our resources in a more helpful way. So beginning by learning what already exists in the community is a step that not only helps us learn the needs of the community, but it also helps us to create those connections we need to do the work in the community. As we now look at imagination, the second one, imagination is important because once we sort of figure out what the needs are, now we can start sort of dreaming and figuring out what are the possibilities with God's help that we can do something different in the community. And this is where, when we start doing this dreaming process, again, it shouldn't be just a committee in the church doing the dreaming, but we should be dreaming with the individuals in the community itself. One of the things that my boss at the seminary says is people support what they invest in. So if they have a say in what we're doing in terms of dreaming, then they're going to invest in it, and it's going to be more successful in terms of the work that we're doing. When we're doing this dreaming, what the church has to do is to make sure that we're discerning God's will for the community, so that this is about divine inspiration and is not simply about something that we can create as humans. So this dreaming process is critically important. Let's now move to incarnation. And as we get to incarnation, this is where, after we've figured out what is needed, after we've done the imagination, we actually physically embody something in the community. So this is where we would actually set up the ministry, we would set up the partnership, we would do that thing that was critically important that we had worked hard to do all this time. When we do this, it means that we're actually embodying something new in the community. And if we've done it well, we've created partners so that it's not just us trying to do it ourselves. And this is critically important. And what is wonderful about this is that when we embody something in the community, and the community is helping us to do it, not only does the church have ownership, but the community takes ownership. And you create something that in most cases tends to be more successful. And finally, when we move to the last piece, imminence, this is where we understand that this work is really ongoing, that there's still things that are pending that are going to be necessary, so that our work is never done. One of the challenges I believe in ministry is when we do something, and particularly if it goes well, we sort of take a sigh of relief because we think we've completed the task and it's over. But the reality is that this work is ongoing, and we're constantly in this struggle of trying to figure out how do we keep this work going for the future, because we're never really done until that day when Christ returns. So this is a reminder that this work is ongoing and that we have to be mindful of it. Let us now go, and I'll be happy to answer questions on that, but I want to go now to our next slide and talk about, I have a new book coming out in April, on April 21st, called The Adept Church, Navigating Between a Rock and a Hard Place. And I want to talk about what I believe are a couple important things that help us to bridge from that insider mentality to using the 4I model. And what I think is critically important is our decision-making process. our tendency is when we make decisions is that we're focusing on ourselves in congregations, and we're not really focusing on how it is that we can touch others in the community. And the example I'll give is the Easter egg hunt. So when we think of a ministry, we think about doing the ministry from the perspective of what does it mean for us to do this for making sure our children have Easter eggs, or what can we do for the church? And as long as people come to the church, we're happy. We have to start thinking about how do we take the ministries we're doing and say, hey, if we move the Easter egg hunt out into the community, it means more children can participate, and it gives us an opportunity to connect with those children. So we have to change the way we make decisions to not think inwardly, but think outwardly, so that in the things we're doing, our first thought should be, can we move this to be more outwardly focused and not simply be inwardly focused? The second thing then I would say, and I'm sure you talked a little bit about this in the previous weeks, is to make sure that we're missionally focused. And I define this is to be missionally focused is God inviting us into the ongoing work of transforming the world. And this transformation is practical, spiritual, and it's directed towards something new. And when we are doing this work, it means then that we are on the path of discipleship, and we are actually making a difference in our communities. The last piece I'll say, and then I'll open it up to conversation, is the other thing we don't necessarily do well in our congregations then is evaluate what we're doing. So oftentimes when we start doing something, we get frustrated if it doesn't go well, or if it is going well, we just keep doing it over and over again. And the reality is, in either case, we should be evaluating what we're doing at least once a year, because when we evaluate, it gives us an opportunity to figure out what are the changes that we can make for trying to make sure we can make it better as we move forward, and not simply doing the same thing over and over again. So that evaluation process is critical. Heather, I'll stop there and open it up first to you and then to everyone so we can be in conversation.
Sure, thanks, Doug. That was really helpful. And just going back to this slide, one of the things that we ask in the Evangelism for Non-Evangelists webinar series, kind of one of our final questions around practices, ties in exactly with what you were saying about transformation, that if we're not planning for, expecting, looking for transformation, why are we doing it? So that part is really important. And then I appreciate what you said about we can't just stop at imminence. And so it's kind of, it's cyclical for a reason, because at some point you need to start inquiring again and imagining that it continues. So just one question that I had, if kind of the default is to be insider minded or to think internally, what are good ways, practices, approaches that you've seen people do that inquiry piece well, and then invite others into that imagination?
Right. I think a couple of things. One is, I always believe starting with a small group of individuals is helpful. So you find 2 or 3 people that would be committed to going out in the community and doing the inquiry process as your starting point. And the goal would be just going out having conversations with individuals. So going out into the community and talking to business owners and finding out, who are their customers, and are there ways that we can be helpful in terms of the work that you're doing. Talking to your neighbors, and in many cases, people who live right next door to the church. No one from the church has ever actually talked to those individuals. So just talking to them and introducing yourself and having those conversations. And when you get 2 or 3 people doing that and they report back to the congregation that it's not so bad when you go talk. They actually talk and have conversations with us. Then you can invite others to join in those conversations. And that's where you can start making those important connections. But I think starting with a small group to start that inquiry process is the way to go. One, you don't want it to be overwhelming for the community where you have, everybody all at once going out trying to talk with people. But secondly, in most cases, you usually have 2 or 3 people who more naturally are outgoing and can do this work probably and are gifted for it better than some others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess too, just how do you, because most of the folks in our congregations have relationships with people outside the church through work, through kids' activities, things like that. Um, are there ways that we can better equip and train our folks to be good listeners, or have a way of having them report back of what they hear around the lunch table or on the sports bleachers?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, again, a couple of things. In many cases, the best evangelists are those who actually can listen well. And truth be told, in many cases, pastors are not the best evangelists because pastors are trained to talk. Pastors are not trained to listen. So individuals that are actually willing to listen to other people, because in many cases, what many people want is just someone to hear their story and to hear what's happening so that when we can have our parishioners actually take the time to sit down and listen to people and even say, hey, we will pray for you, or, we will be willing to touch you in some way, that can make a huge difference. The challenge, honestly, for most of us is our lives are so busy, it's hard to take that time to spend with people, even to listen to them. So sort of training people to slow down and being willing to listen and have those conversations are critically important.
Mm, that's great. So as we want to make sure, especially talking about context, that we're able to hear from all of you and maybe particular situations that you have in your context. So Jason, one, have some questions already come in, but two, we thought it would be interesting. We did on the very first session, we had a map out and we talked about kind of the diverse locations we are all coming from, but even as we know, churches that are in the same town can have very different contexts. So we would love to hear, as you submit your questions, also submit in the chat box. Tell us a little bit about your ministry setting and your context so we can get a feel for where you guys are living and serving. But Jason, have we had some questions come in at this point?
Yes, we have had a couple of questions come in, and I'll just encourage folks to keep sending those in using the chat. And at the same time, Heather has also asked that you put in the chat what kind of context you're currently serving in, if you're an urban ministry or rural setting, what part of the country that you're in, so that we can all refresh our memory and ask questions regarding around that. Okay, so a couple of questions here. Let's take Jeff's question first. What are your thoughts of an asset-based approach to the community as an expression or a discovery of prevenient grace?
I am, to Jeff, I strongly believe in an asset base because the wonderful thing about prevenient grace is the grace that is already sort of going before us, that we aren't actually taking God to people, but God is already active. And what we're trying to do is help point people to the way that God is already working. So when we're doing an asset-based approach, what we're really doing is really finding sort of the gifts and everything that already exists in the community, and hopefully then helping to point them to saying, hey, we can already see God is active in what is taking place and the gifts that are already being expressed here. So I actually think they actually work well together because God is already doing wonderful things in all of these communities. What we have to be able to do is help people to see how God is active and then walk beside them, then hopefully as they take that journey of discipleship.
And along those same lines, Kenneth has asked a question. In the communities, there are several opportunities to participate with other non-religious groups. What are some criteria, context for the church to decide whether to participate or not participate?
Thank you, Ken, for a good question. I think a couple things. Those are wonderful opportunities. And having participated in a couple of those things, I think a couple of things or a couple of mistakes Christians often make. Oftentimes, we sort of want to downplay Christianity and downplay sort of our faith. But the reality is, for those things to work well, the hope is that we actually authentically are expressing who we are as Christians. This doesn't mean that we are trying to beat the other people over the head with the Bible, but we authentically express why we're Christians and what we believe. Here's where E. Stanley Jones, and I know Heather later is going to refer to the book, I think is really helpful in his idea of the round table, where everyone would have an opportunity to sort of talk about their faith witness and their perspective. And it really became a discussion where everyone was able to have an opportunity to express why they believe what they believed. And it wasn't I'm going to say I'm better than you or you're better than me. But Jones was always grounded in that he genuinely believed Christ was the way and that Christianity was the religion for him. But people were willing to engage him because of his openness to allow others to authentically express their faith. So to sort of now answer your question directly, I think that we want to allow others to genuinely express their faith. We want to make sure it's a space where people are not beating each other up, but it's also a space where the expectation is not that as Christians we have to downplay our faith and that we can genuinely express who we are. Because there are opportunities in the community, even though we may have different beliefs, where there still are places where we can work together to make a difference in the community, and that can be important if we can have those dialogues. I don't know, Heather, if you wanted to add anything from E. Stanley Jones at this point, or if you wanted to wait.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I think one of the pieces in that book too is where, well, E. Stanley Jones and Gandhi were great friends. And when E. Stanley Jones asked Gandhi what the Christians could do, he was very clear about being able to articulate your faith in a strong way and why that you're doing. Because he said, you know, we really like this Jesus person, we're not so sure about Christians. but if it's tied back to who Jesus is and what Jesus did, and we're firm about that, that doesn't, I think a lot of times we're so busy saying what we're not and what we're against that we don't share what we believe and what motivates us, and how that's grounded in our relationship with Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's true. And Gandhi even at one point said that he was almost convinced because of Jesus to be a follower, and basically said, I love Jesus, but I don't believe in Christians. Yeah.
Our next question in contextual awareness is around the inquiry process. And Faye says, many times folks in the pews don't know or understand exactly what the community needs. Are there some tools, some demographic data that folks might tap into that give them an understanding of the community around them? And I'll just tag on there too. A lot of times we get enamored by technology. As a technology guy, I could say that. We get enamored by technology What are some of the low-tech ways that we could be contextually aware of what's going on around us and around the church property?
A couple of things that sort of combines in answering both questions is that Mission Insight, of course, is the instrument that we use most often in United Methodist Church, and it gives us the census data and tells us who's in the community, the number of people in the community that are going to church, the people who aren't going to church. So it sort of gives us a real sense and feel of the community and the businesses and all that sort of information. So that is typically available through most of our conferences. And you can also go and get free census data just in your area by usually Googling sort of the census for your zip code. But I'm a firm believer, if possible, the best thing to really do is just to go out and walk the community if you're able. And walk in the community, because no matter how good the census data is, it's going to still miss some things that when you actually go out and physically walk, that you're going to be able to see, and then also, of course, engage in those conversations. So the low-tech way is to actually just go out and physically sort of walk around your community. Now, certainly, when I was in the Kansas area, which was more rural, going out in the community meant that you could be surrounded by cornfields, so that walking the community in that case wouldn't have the same impact. But even there, typically you still had neighbors, so that you might be, in that case, actually driving to talk to other individuals that are in the farming business, or to the town where people would gather at the post office or the coffee shop. So in those cases, there are still ways to make those connections, but the low tech way is actually to physically get out there yourself and actually see what is there and confirm what the census data is telling you, because sometimes it is off. Communities today are changing, and changing quickly, and it's one of the challenges our churches face. Our churches, in many cases, at one point in time reflected their community, but because of shifts in the community, they no longer reflect the community, and there becomes a disconnect when that happens. And one of the ways to sort of try to build that bridge again is to physically get out there so that you can sort of see those shifts taking place.
Yeah, and I would, just to follow up on that, would say that not being a pastor of a local church for about 7 years now, I do feel like I have a better sense of my communities, being a person in the pew on Sundays, but also having a child in a lot of activities and spending time on bleachers and at school events and at scout campouts, and I'm able to kind of hear the places, and pointing back to this diagram of, where are the places where there's a huge gap between the way things are and the reign of God. What's keeping people up at night? What are the ways people are not able to experience abundant life? And I think if you do listen, you'll hear it. And maybe every church can't address every issue, but that goes back to that asset-based, internal and external context. What are the strengths internally? What are the assets you have to be able to address those needs? Because we can't be everything to everybody. And I don't believe God calls us to be, because he's gathered that group of people together who have a certain set of gifts and strengths to make an impact.
And I would just add to that, I often talk about, I think what is important is to really try to focus on trying to do one thing. Because often we try to do or become everything to everybody, and it's just not possible. But if we can really focus on one thing and do that well, There will be opportunities in the future to do other things, but really starting and just saying, what we know we can do is we can make a difference in providing shelter for individuals. So just figuring out all the ways that we can partner and be in ministry to do that work in the community. Instead of just trying to say we're going to, try to do shelter and food and toy drive and all that, so that you start sort of, becoming thin because you're trying to do too much, but really focusing our efforts on doing one thing.
Great. We had any other questions or folks shared their contacts, Jason?
Yeah, so what are some tools around discovering your strengths? Talking about, so I'm going to combine a couple of things here between imminence and imagine. It's nice to dream and do these kind of things, and yet when the rubber meets the road, we tend to fall back and say, well, this group over there is doing this. They have basketball. And this group over here, they're handing out tracts. And that group over there is doing this. Why don't we just do some of that? And so you talk about, let's figure out what it is that we do well. Is there a structure or a framework to kind of walk through that to help folks really discover what their strengths are, as opposed to just copying what somebody else is doing and using that as a fallback position?
I would say a couple of things. So the first is that within congregations, all congregations typically have people who bring gifts to the table. And I'll give a concrete example. This was a congregation, an older congregation, where you had women who used to knit, and they had a knitting club. And, the congregation was dying because basically everybody was over the age of 65. And finally, one day, the suggestion was, let's take the knitting club to the local McDonald's and knit there. And when they did that, they discovered that some of the younger people were actually interested in learning how to knit. And it became a way for them to sort of connect with individuals that eventually helped the church to gain some life. It was never going to be a large congregation, but it certainly became more stable. But my point there is that it was something they were already doing in knitting. And what they did, instead of having it sort of inwardly focused, they made it outwardly focused, and they were able to connect with people. So oftentimes our strengths are things we're already doing in the congregation. The problem is nobody knows we're doing them. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of taking those things and moving them to being more outwardly focused, so that others can then actually learn that this is a strength of ours and that we're doing it. So that would be the first thing I say. Look for things you're already doing. Don't reinvent the wheel, but take something you're doing and just move it outside of the congregation. The second thing I think is important is think about doing experiments. Oftentimes, the challenge in congregations is that we use that famous line, "We tried it before," and then we get afraid to try different things. So that what I like to talk about is try experiment. So as we look at what other people are doing, and we say, hey, we want to do something. We see people may be doing basketball, and they might be doing this. So we may say, what we want to do is see if people are interested in a music camp. So the way to approach it is to think of it as an experiment. So let's say, let's try an experiment where we're going to do the experiment for 3 months and partner and see what happens. And after that 3 months, we'll evaluate and see where we are and move forward at that time. So when we talk about doing it as an experiment, it doesn't make it sound permanent, and people are more willing to engage, I think, when they don't feel like you're setting up something permanent. So the second piece I would say is think about doing experiments and not necessarily just saying we're going to create this ministry that feels like it's going to be around forever. And the third piece, I would say, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, is as you're doing inquiry and learning some of the needs, I mean, then it's coming back to the congregation and finding out if we have that giftedness in the congregation. In many cases, we are often surprised by what people have done outside of the church, because we sort of only know them in this one context. So, you know, sometimes, just to give another concrete example, at this particular church, the community needed somebody who had some expertise in technology. And it just so happens there was this person who had started his own tech business and had retired, but nobody in the congregation knew this until one day he overheard this conversation about technology. So oftentimes when people hear of needs that are there, they actually have the gifts for that, but we actually just don't know that those gifts are already in our congregation. So sometimes when we come back and say, you know, this is what is needed, does anyone actually have the gifts to help us to make this happen? We're often surprised that people have those things. So those would be the sort of three ways that I would say that we would try to think about how we would sort of figure out our strengths to actually do this work.
Yeah, that's good. And Doug, especially you mentioned the importance of evaluation. So with those experiments, especially doing that evaluative work of, even if it's not something that you're going to continue, what did we learn?
That's right.
What was positive from this? Or is there something we just need to tweak? But not just saying we tried it and moving on, but taking the time to process. And then I think too, what you said about giftedness is really important inside the church, but then helping people to see and linking it to discipleship in their everyday lives. How can I use these passions, these skills, these gifts to be in service, not just with an organized thing at my church, but as I engage with neighbors and community every day. That we're not just living it out through organized programs, but are sent back into the world every week. Yeah. So any other questions, Jason, or context?
Jeff says he lives in a town with a population of less than 10,000 people, and yet they've got non-United Methodist churches in their zip code. So to tie off of the previous question, any suggestions on how to get the churches to evangelize in partnership, to work more in concert organizationally instead of individually?
And you know, I always try to be honest. The challenge is that we base things off of sort of membership, right? You know, the goal is to get people to join my church and become a member of my church. So for us to move away from sort of thinking about simply membership at my church and really thinking about how do we do the work of transforming lives and making disciples, which means that someone may not necessarily come to my church, but what we're going to work to do is to get them on that journey, and hopefully they will be in one of the 9 churches, you know, in the area, or even they may go to another denomination, but the goal is to really get them to take that journey of discipleship. So I think we have to alter the conversation from, you know, how do we get people to become members of my congregation, to how do we do the work of actually making disciples so that we really are transforming the world. And it's challenging because the way we measure success is based off of membership and is tied into membership. is not necessarily based off of, we came together to help 10 people to take this journey, but none of those 10 people are at my congregation. So I think that's the challenge we face in working together. But if we can alter that sort of conversation, I think it will make a difference. And that has to start really, I think, with creating a dialogue with a group of people who are committed to saying, we're not going to compete with one another, but we really are going to work together to figure out how can we really make a difference and really work on discipleship and not simply get caught in this trap of trying to just simply get behinds in our pews.
Doug, do you think it's helpful also to do that internal work of identity and giftedness? And so what is unique about our congregation and understanding that, and the gifts that we bring in, our strengths and our identity, and how they complement each other instead of competing against each other?
Absolutely, and a lot of that is tied to really figuring out what's the mission and vision for your congregation.
Yeah.
And I'm one who firmly believes that, that we really think about a mission that is unique to our congregation, and that has to be revisited every so often because, of course, the complex of the congregation is going to change. But if we're actually living into that mission, then that's going to talk to sort of our identity and our uniqueness as we do that work.
And what role
I'm sorry, Jason, let me just say, and I think is also challenging because one of the things is that our ministry should line up then with that mission. So if they're not lining up with the mission, then the question becomes, can they line up with the mission, or should we stop doing that ministry? And that's where you have some really challenging conversations, because of course nobody likes to hear that we shouldn't be doing this. But again, I think that's where, as congregations, we sometimes get off track. We start having pet projects instead of thinking about how is this really helping us to do what we say we are claiming as our mission for our congregation at this time. Sorry about that, Jason.
It's all right. And so is there, what role can an annual conference or similar organization play in facilitating that?
I think a couple of things. One is we really have to think about ways to help move beyond simply membership and really think about how do we create metrics for the way that we can touch lives in the community. So that's one place where annual conference can help. And I think the second thing is we're going to have to figure out sort of reclaiming our Wesleyan heritage. How do we create healthy and vital smaller congregations and not simply think of mega churches? The reality is that the Wesleyan movement was started with, what would be considered smaller congregations by the standards of today, and not really thinking in terms of mega churches. But these were healthy congregations just because of the way they were accountable to each other and the way that they were working in the community and making a difference. So I think trying to figure out how to sort of reclaim of not simply trying to become as large as you can, but more importantly is how do we really become vital regardless of what our size is, to me would be the other places where conferences can be really helpful.
And Jeff is tagging on to that, this thread that we've got going here around doing asset-based work within our congregations. And taking that into account, how can we do better at charge conference reports?
I like that question. Uh, I think, part of the challenge is that we've created a paradigm where there's a certain expectation, and we fill out the reports through a lens of that expectation. And what would be, in my opinion, more helpful, this is just my opinion, is really thinking about, what is it that would help us to live out our mission in this particular community, and going back to the asset basing, where we actually are figuring out what it would mean to partner with the gifts in this community to make a difference, and think about our charge conference reports from that lens, instead of sort of the lens that we tend to. That would be a pretty big shift from the way we currently do it. But I think, again, I think that could make a big difference if we sort of shifted the lens through which we think about those reports.
I think also in how can we tell more stories, especially connected to transformation. So how is the community different, or how is the reign of God more realized in our neighborhoods and our community this year than it was the previous year? And just a plug for the Foundation for Evangelism. Those are the stories we want to hear too, and to be able to share. So I know a lot of times we're so focused on numbers and metrics, but I think part of the measurement needs to include stories.
And just to be inclusive of those folks that are not part of the United Methodist system, just briefly explain what a charge conference report is and how it's currently populated.
Sure. A charge conference report is a report that every congregation does annually that sort of goes through, we will say, church statistics in terms of how many people are in worship, the different ministries of the congregation, the budget of the congregation. And it does talk about, for some of them, asking sort of the goals and the hopes of the congregation and the work that the congregation is doing. And this report goes up to, for those who are not United Methodists, if you think of the boss of the pastor is sort of the district superintendent. So the district superintendent would be the one that would sort of get the report initially, and ultimately the report goes to the boss of all of us, which would be the bishop. But the charge conference report is a way for the district superintendent and the bishop to get a sense of what is taking place in all of the congregations, is the hope.
And it's the one meeting a year. It's the official connection between the local church and the annual conference. Oh, I think you're muted, Jason.
Oh, sorry. There we go. Thank you for that. And there's similar type of data gathered in various denominations around those same areas.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's very helpful. So it sounds like there's some opportunity to do some more asset-based assessment as part of that report out to the district superintendent, not just the hard numbers in terms of membership and financials.
Yes.
All right. Judy asks our next question, and her context is she's in a rural setting in Nebraska. It's basically a farming community, although also a bedroom community, people who commute to nearby cities to work. Her small town has lost several businesses over the past years, and her congregation now is about 95% over the age of 65, which can be a real blessing, but on the face, it's not something that we tend to think about. So help us do a little bit of imagination around the potential with that kind of congregation.
Yeah, I don't know if Judy's United Methodist, but that would be the Great Plains Conference, if she is United Methodist. Um, Judy's congregation is not that unique from, I would say, where over 50% of our congregations are moving. And I think a couple of things are critical. Um, One is really having individuals not get focused on age, but again, think about gifts and the gifts that they can still give. I talked about the group that knitted earlier. There was another congregation where individuals figured out that they were able to do work in a local elementary school, of partnering with them in terms of providing reading and other assistance for things. So it's sort of finding that niche where you're you can have your people still engaged in the community and not get stuck on just because we're of a certain age, there's nothing that we can do to really contribute and make a difference in the community. The second thing that I would say is there's a misnomer that younger people don't want to sort of be connected to people as they mature, and that's really not true. What they want is to be heard also, in many cases, by people who are more mature and are really looking for that relationship. So I think there's opportunities there to create intergenerational relationships that we often do not sort of take advantage of because we sort of think that they are not interested in sort of being around us as we get older. So I would say the second thing is look for those intergenerational opportunities because in many cases, younger people are really excited to be in those relationships. And finally, the last thing I would say to Judy is I think the challenge is trying to change the mentality of having people come to us. You know, oftentimes what happens, especially for individuals who have been in the church for a while of that age, is they remember the heyday of the church, which typically is the 50s or 60s for them, when the church was full and everybody was coming to them in the church. And trying to change the mentality to really that first step of people aren't going to come to us, we're going to have to go and inquire and get outside of the walls of our church and go to them. So even if you can just make that first step of getting people to have those conversations outside of the church, I think you've made a tremendous step.
Yeah, that's great. And I think a lot of times there has been a fear, if you've been in a state of decline for a while, there's almost this low self-esteem or feeling that we don't have anything to offer to overcome. But what a gift. I think one of the huge gifts of the small membership church is intergenerational ministry. A lot of the mega churches compartmentalize and they have age level ministries, and I think the church is meant to be folks of all ages and stages learning and growing together. So I think that is a great gift and opportunity that small membership churches offer.
Absolutely. And I would also say to Judy, just want to, if she, there's a movement called Messy Church, actually started in England. But Messy Church is sort of an intergenerational approach, and what it tries to do is bring together people of different generations around a different idea of church. So it's something that she may want to investigate because a lot of smaller congregations have found it as a way, particularly for people who have not been into church, for them to sort of find that first point of connection and coming together. So that's something else that she can just sort of think about.
Some great tips. All right. Well, I'm keeping an eye on the clock.
Oh, yeah.
So, folks, if you could continue to send in your questions, and we'll just have to answer those offline.
Yes. Thank you, Jason. Let me see. It says I'm still sharing, but it's not advancing. Let's see. There we go. We've been through our questions. And as we begin to wrap up, as we've said earlier, this group was kind of an invitation only, an audience, was a way of thanking you for either being a friend of the foundation or for being a past participant in the webinars. But just wanted to let you know, as an upcoming resource, that we would love to have you share. We'll be packaging this 3-week series, and I'll be writing a study guide to accompany this. So we hope that this will be something that you can share and use in your ministry context, that would be helpful to bring others to engage in this conversation as well. So be on the lookout for that in January. When it's ready, we'll let you know and send you a link so that you can utilize that. But as you're planning for the next semester and the first of the year, know that's an opportunity for you to include in your programming, and would love to have you utilize this resource and share it. Also, a lot of you have participated in the Evangelism for Non-Evangelists webinar in the past, but we will be offering it again, Mark Teasdale and I, beginning February 5th. So if you have folks in your congregation that might benefit from diving into that equation a little more deeply, or if you haven't had the opportunity, we'd love to have you join us, and you can register for that now at the Garrett website. Got the link there, and we'll forward that to you as well. But would love to have you join us beginning in February for that. Again, really want to thank you all for being part of this. I want to say a special thanks to Doug, and we've been blessed by him, and in the previous weeks with Jack and Lacey and their willingness and their expertise in the ways that they have helped us to think about evangelism in fresh ways. If you, as we're logging off, or tomorrow, if you have additional questions that I can forward to Doug, he would be happy to receive those. There is my email address. Please reach out, or if there's other ways as you continue to process that I can help walk alongside. That's what I'm here for as well. But as Doug mentioned, I was going to conclude tonight by sharing some thoughts from E. Stanley Jones. And this is a resource that Doug and Jack actually co-edited and gathered articles and chapters from other Wesleyan scholars and some of our other E. Stanley Jones professors. But it's E. Stanley Jones and Sharing the Good News in a Pluralistic Society. And this project was made possible also by a grant from the foundation. But want to recommend this resource. I think it's really helpful. If you've been in my classes in the past at one of the seminaries, this has been assigned reading for my class this upcoming semester. It will be as well. But this could also be a great Sunday school book or a small group study. But this is from the chapter on public witness that Kim Reisman wrote. And this is what she shares about Jones in his work in India. As the church announced Christ, it also had to model Christ. As he watched faith in Jesus Christ breaking out beyond the borders of the Christian church, he wondered, Mrs. Jones, will the present Christian church be big enough, responsive enough, Christ-like enough to be the medium and organ through which Christ will come to India or the United States or Trinidad and Tobago, or insert your context? Will the Christian church be Christ-like enough to be the moral and spiritual center of this overflowing Christianity? At the heart of his concern was a truth that cuts across time and place. When people catch a glimpse of the Spirit of Jesus and begin to gain an understanding of what it means to be a follower of Christ, they begin to judge the church and Christians in that light. Jones believed that both an individual's witness and the church's public witness are intimately connected to personal and corporate embodiment of the gospel. He recognized the importance of integrity to effective and authentic evangelism. Our words must ring true to our lives, and our lives must reinforce our words. So that is our prayer for each of you as you continue to lead and serve. We thank you for your heart and your passion to share the good news of Jesus Christ within your congregations and with your communities, and pray blessings on you as you go forth to love and to serve. With that, thank you, Doug, and Jason, I'll have you sign us off tonight.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Doug and Heather. Appreciate your time today. Folks, as a reminder, this entire session was recorded. Give us about 24 hours to have that ready for you, and you'll get a link in your inbox. So that does it for us today. Thank you all for joining us, and we wish you a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.